Okay, welcome back everyone. This video lecture is going to cover chapter 4.3, Connective Tissue Supports and Protects. And I just wanted to apologize right off the bat if this video is just slightly longer than normal because there's a lot of information to cover here. I don't want to go too quickly, but at the same time, remember, this is to support your reading of the chapter, and so hopefully we can do it in a relatively normal amount of time. So the first thing that connective tissue does is it supports things in the body. Examples of this are the connective tissue sheath that surrounds muscle cells, the tendons that attach muscles to bones, and the skeleton that supports the body itself. But connective tissue also protects. Examples of this are the fibrous capsules and bones that will protect organs, the skeletal system itself, the specialized cells in connective tissue that defend the body from microorganisms, the blood and lymph, which can transport fluid, nutrients, waste, and chemical messengers around the body, and adipose cells that are able to store surplus energy in the form of fat, which also insulates and cushions the body. Let's talk about that embryonic form of where this connective tissue comes from. All connective tissue derives from the mesoderm layer. So remember, we have an endoderm, an ectoderm, and a mesoderm, and all connective tissue comes from the mesoderm layer of the embryo. The first connective tissue that develops is called the mesenchyme, which is the stem cell line from which all connective tissues are later derived. Mesenchymal cells are scattered throughout the body, and they're multipotent, which means that they can form into all types of connective tissue cells. Instead of all types of cells, which would be totipotent, they can form into all types of connective tissue cells. So they'll help to replace and repair connective tissue. Let's talk about how we classify different types of connective tissue. The first is something called connective tissue proper, which includes loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Let's define those. Dense connective tissue is reinforced by bundles of fibers that provide strength, elasticity, and protection. Whereas loose connective tissue, the fibers are going to be loosely organized with large spaces in between. So we'll get into both of those. The other is supportive connective tissue. That is the bone and cartilage. And then lastly is the fluid connective tissue, which is the lymph and blood. So we're going to talk about all of these individually now. Let's talk about connective tissue proper. First of all, the most common cell type here is called a fibroblast. They secrete materials that can combine with extracellular fluids to produce this viscous ground substance. It's basically what the cells are embedded in, what basically supports the connective tissue itself. Okay, we'll get a little bit into ground substance in a later slide as well. The second type and the second most common are called fibrocytes, and I just think of them as a less active fibroblast. And then we have a third type of cell called the adipocytes, the cells that store fat. There's both white and brown adipocytes, producing white fat and brown fat. White fat is less metabolically active than brown fat. You'll read a little bit more about that in the chapter. But just for now, knowing that adipocytes is the adipose cells. Let's talk about cell types in connective tissue proper. The first is the mesenchymal cell, which I just told you is that multipotent adult stem cell. It's a cell that can differentiate into any type of connective tissue cell. It restores and repairs when there are connective tissue damages or even death. We also have a macrophage cell, which is a large type of blood cell which can enter the connective tissue matrix from the blood vessels. It's an essential part of the immune system because they can signal other immune cells to where infections are. And then we have, lastly, a mast cell. Mast cells contain chemical signals that you might have heard of before called histamine and heparin. These cause inflammatory responses like itching and redness and swelling, things that you might be aware of if you've ever had some sort of immunological response or allergic reaction. Let's talk about the different types of connective tissue fibers. There's the collagen fiber. Collagen fibers are made from fibrous protein subunits that are linked together in long chains. Collagen fiber allows for things to be flexible and have great strength. So You're probably pretty familiar with collagen. Anything that has lots of collagen will resist stretching, like ligaments and tendons. You can stretch your legs and jump up and down, and you can do all of these things because it has this collagen fiber. The next type of fiber is an elastic fiber. It contains the protein elastin. So you kind of know what elasticity is. It will, anything that you can pull apart and will return to its original shape. Think of a rubber band. When you stretch or compress something that's elastic, it always returns to its original shape. We find a lot of this in the skin. So if you can take a part of your skin and pull it, and you realize that it bounces right back to its original shape. We also find them in the vertebral column. The last type of fiber is the reticular fiber. It's made up of the same subunits as collagen. However, instead of being formed together in these long chains, they're formed into this branching network. It's most abundant in soft organs like the liver and spleen, where they sort of hold it together. They anchor and support it. They anchor and support the parenchyma, which is another term that I want you to know. Parenchyma is just a term for all of the functional tissues. So we have the connective tissue, which supports the parenchyma, or which is all the functional tissues. Let's go back to that ground substance really quickly. All connective tissue fiber types are embedded in what is called the ground substance. It's secreted by those fibroblasts. It's this mixture of polysaccharides, proteins, and it traps water or moisture, and it forms this clear jelly-like substance that supports the connective tissues, and it allows for messages to be sent from cell to cell. So that's what the ground substance is. It's just basically what the connective tissue fiber types are embedded in. Okay, now let's get into the loose connective tissue. This is connective tissue proper, one of the types. So it's found between many organs, it helps to absorb shock, and it binds tissues together. It allows water, salts, and nutrients to diffuse through adjacent cells. Remember, because they're not tightly packed together, these are the loose connective tissues. Adipose tissue is an example. Adipose tissue does fat storage, lipid storage, which is fat, insulation, and cushioning. Another example is the areolar tissue, which fills the spaces between muscle fibers. It can surround blood and lymph vessels and supports organs in the abdominal region. This tissue is the main connective tissue component of epithelial membranes, or basically, remember when we talked about epithelial membranes, what the epithelial tissue is connected to in the basement membrane. We also have reticular tissue, which is this mesh-like supportive framework for soft organs like the liver or spleen. Okay, so that was a loose connective tissue. Let's talk about dense connective tissue. It contains more collagen fibers than the loose connective tissue does, okay? That means it's going to have greater resistance to stretching. Makes sense so far. There's two types. So there's regular dense tissue where the fibers of collagen are parallel to each other, which enhances strength and resistance in the direction those fibers are facing. You see those in ligaments and tendons, right? Ligaments and tendons are really supposed to go in very certain ways. If they go the other way, that's probably not good, and they're not going to be able to stretch and resist the stretching as much. Then we have irregular dense tissue where the direction of the fibers is random. It can either be sort of in this mesh-like, or it can just sort of be laid on top of each other. But what this gives is greater strength in all directions. So one example is the dermis of the skin, and also artery walls. So the artery walls, if you think about what an artery has to do, is to pump a lot of blood, and it needs to be sort of able to contain all of that stretching in every direction. Okay, let's talk about the supportive connective tissue. That's the cartilage and bone. Cartilage and bone allows the body to maintain posture and also protect internal organs. The chondrocytes are the cartilage cells. They occupy spaces called lacunae, which is a layer of dense, irregular, they occupy spaces called lacunae. And then we have the perichondrium, which is a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue that encapsulates the cartilage. So when you look at the chapter, you'll see a book, you'll see the chondrocytes, which are the cells that are the cartilage cells themselves. They're in these little spaces of the perichondrium called lacunae. Cartilage is what is called avascular. And what that means is there's no blood vessels in them. And so all the nutrients that would normally be carried to other cells by blood need to diffuse through the matrix itself. And that's going to make healing cartilaginous tissue slow. So if you ever like tear your meniscus in your knee, that's not really going to repair itself. You're going to have to get surgery on that. Whereas what we'll see later is if you break a bone, you don't normally need to get a surgery as long as it's not totally puncturing through the skin or something like that. Bones can heal themselves because they are vascular. So let's move on. Let's talk about types of cartilage. The first is hyaline cartilage. It's the most common type, and it has short, dispersed collagen fibers and large amounts of what are called proteoglycans. The surface is smooth, and it means it's strong and flexible. You'll find these in the rib cage and the nose, and it covers bones and joints. The next one is called fibrocartilage. It's tough because it's got thick bundles of collagen. The meniscus in the knee is an example of fibrocartilage. And the last that we'll talk about is the elastic cartilage, which contains elastic fibers, but it also contains collagen and proteoglycans. It's got rigid support and elasticity. The best example I can give you is your earlobes. You pull them and bend them, and they always go back to the same shape, and that's due to their elastic fibers. Okay, now let's talk about bone, the other connective tissue. It's obviously the hardest connective tissue. It protects, supports the body. It's mostly made up of collagen fibers that are embedded in the ground substance, but in the ground substance, in the bone, it's mineralized, right? You know that bones are hard. If the ground substance was not mineralized, bone would mostly be made up of collagen fibers, and that would mean the bones would be bendy and stretchy, and we don't want bones to do that, right? We want to be able to stand upright and do all the things that we need to do. So that's why we need a mineralized ground substance for bones. Bone cells are called osteocytes. So just like chondrocytes are the cells that make up cartilage, start with a C, by the way, and osteo, you could think of like osteoporosis, right, where bone gets holes in it because of a disease that happens. But osteocytes are the cells that make bone. They are located in the lacunae, which is the little spaces of the matrix, just like the chondrocytes and cartilage are located in the lacunae of the matrix. Bone is vascular, like I said, unlike cartilage, so it can heal relatively quickly, right? If you've ever broken a bone, you know that you just kind of have to immobilize it, put it in a cast so it doesn't continue to move, and the body can heal itself through bringing the materials through the blood vessels. Okay, so we talked about that. Now let's talk about the fluid connective tissue. That's the blood and the lymph. In both the blood and the lymph, cells circulate in a liquid extracellular matrix, right? We're pretty familiar with the extracellular matrix of blood anyway, that it's a liquid. In blood, we have erythrocytes, which are the red blood cells that transport oxygen and small amounts of carbon dioxide. We have leukocytes, which are the white blood cells. We know those defend against pathogens. And platelets, which are involved in clotting. And when we talk about lymph also contains a liquid matrix, and they have white blood cells. Lymphatic capillaries are actually very permeable, which means that they allow these larger molecules to enter. Lymph then is able to drain into blood vessels, and so due to the fact that they're so permeable, they can actually bring large molecules like fats to the blood. And with that, I'm going to stop there. Remember, this was going over chapter 4.3. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. There's a lot of information in this chapter, and looks like we kept it under 15 minutes, so I'm happy about that. Talk to you next time.